I was halfway through stacking firewood outside my cabin when I heard the screech. That chimney is an absolute eyesore, I turned, already knowing who it was. Edwina, HOA president. Late 50s, platinum bob, thick sunglasses even though it was clouded over, and a clipboard like it was surgically attached to her hand. She stood at the edge of my gravel driveway like she was about to call in an airstrike. "Good morning to you too, Edwina," I said, brushing ash off my hands. She stomped up the path like she owned the mountain. "This entire neighborhood has a rustic charm, Samuel. What you've built here," she pointed dramatically at my stone chimney, "ruins that aesthetic." I looked at the chimney. Solid fieldstone, hand-laid, matched the rest of the cabin. It wasn't even new. I built it 5 years ago, right after buying the place in Timber Hollow, a small mountain neighborhood just outside of Asheville. I'd submitted the plans, followed the HOA's guidelines to the letter, and got written approval. "You're talking about the chimney that's been here since 2018, I asked, keeping my tone polite. "The one your board signed off on," her nostrils flared, and she blinked hard like she hadn't expected me to remember that. "That was before I took over as president," she snapped. "And I've reviewed the design standards," I cut her off. "And yet, the bylaws say any previously approved structures are grandfathered in. You'd know that if you read them." She froze. I could see her brain working overtime behind those oversized sunglasses. Then she pulled a folded paper from her clipboard and shoved it at me. "This is an official notice of violation. You have 15 days to remove or alter the chimney to comply with updated design codes." I took the paper, unfolded it, and read it. The letterhead was real, sure, but the signature. Not the architectural committee's. It was hers, alone, no vote, no record, no process. "You do realize you can't unapprove something just because you don't like it, right?" I said. Edwina snorted. "I am the board president. If something doesn't fit the community standards, I will see to it that it's corrected, regardless of who approved what in the past." I almost laughed. "And if I don't, I'll start fines, daily, retroactive, starting today." She turned sharply and marched down the path. "You'll be hearing from us." I watched her go, then looked back at my chimney, a literal stone tower of evidence that she was full of it. I wasn't just some clueless cabin dweller. I was a contractor by trade, and before that, I worked 6 years for the county zoning office. I knew how paper trails worked. I knew what boards could and couldn't do. And most importantly, I kept copies of everything. I headed inside, grabbed the binder from my filing cabinet, and flipped to the tab labeled HOA Approvals. There it was, signed minutes from a board meeting in April 2018. Approval for the construction. Names, dates, signatures. Edwina had just tried to rewrite history. And she'd done it wrong. I wasn't going to just sit back and let her turn my chimney into some kind of HOA trophy kill. She wanted a fight. She just picked the wrong guy to mess with. I spent that evening scanning copies of everything in the binder minutes, approvals, construction photos with timestamps, even the receipts for the stone I'd hauled in myself. Then I uploaded the whole file to a shared drive and made a second backup on a thumb drive. I wasn't just covering my bases. I knew Edwina wasn't the type to back off because of a few documents. She'd dig in, double down, and try to make an example out of me. People like her didn't like being proven wrong. They saw it as a challenge. The next morning, I didn't have to wait long. By the time I'd brewed coffee and pulled on my boots, my phone buzzed, an email from the HOA's compliance committee. New fines. $1,000, accruing daily, retroactive to yesterday, and a threat. Failure to pay would result in a lien on the property. I stared at the screen, then laughed out loud. She was coming in hot. I forwarded the email to my attorney, a friend from my zoning days named Marissa, along with the scanned documents. Then I printed the email, clipped it to the rest of the file, and slid it into a bright red folder. If Edwina wanted to play games, I'd bring the whole set. At noon, I drove down the hill to the Timber Hollow Community Center. The monthly board meeting was scheduled for that evening, but I wanted to get a good look at the lay of the land. Sure enough, the lot was already half full. Edwina's white Lexus was parked diagonally across two spots, like it was allergic to parallel lines. Inside, the main hall was decked out with folding chairs and a long plastic table up front with name cards for the board. A fresh banner reading, "Preserve the Hollow's Charm," hung above the stage. I spotted Hank Ramirez in the back sipping from a thermos and eyeing the setup like it might explode. "Sam," he said, nodding as I walked over. "Heard you got hit." "She thinks she can rewrite the bylaws," I replied, lowering my voice. "You notice anything off lately?" He leaned forward. 3 people got fines this week, all for stuff that's been there for years. My split rail fence, built in '06, now apparently it's a safety hazard. That come with a $1,000 price tag too, $800, but yeah, same threat about a lien. I scanned the hall. A few more residents had trickled in, some I knew by name, others just familiar faces from mailbox run-ins. I saw at least 2 more flipping through bright yellow violation slips. Something was off. This wasn't just personal anymore. By 6:30, the room was packed. Edwina swept in last, trailing 2 younger board members, both in matching navy jackets with Timber Hollow patches sewn on the sleeves. She didn't acknowledge anyone, just walked straight to the front, set down her clipboard, and tapped the mic. "Good evening, everyone. As your elected board president, I want to begin by addressing the growing concern over neighborhood aesthetics. It has come to our attention that several properties have deviated significantly from the original vision of Timber Hollow." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "We are initiating a community-wide review of structures, landscaping, and exterior features to ensure compliance with the updated architectural standards." She paused, scanning the room like a queen surveying peasants. "This is about preserving value, not punishing residents. Those receiving fines have ample opportunity to correct violations." I stood. "Question for the board," I said, holding up my red folder. "What process was followed to update the architectural standards?" Her expression tightened. "Changes were reviewed and approved by the board." "Which board?" "Because the last published standards are from 2020 and there's no record of amendments since then. That's internal documentation, not subject to public distribution." I opened the folder and pulled out the printed bylaws. Section 6, Paragraph 3 says any changes to architectural standards must be presented at a public meeting and passed by majority vote of both the board and attending residents. A few people in the crowd nodded. Linda from Maple Ridge crossed her arms and leaned forward. Edwina's jaw worked. "We are within our rights to enforce community standards." "So you're saying you skipped the vote and just decided on your own?" I asked, louder now. "Because I've got documentation showing my chimney was approved in 2018 and this so-called violation is fabricated." Gasps. Someone said, "Wait, approved?" I held up the signed page. Board minutes. April 23, 2018. Signed by the Architectural Committee and filed with the HOA secretary. "My chimney's not a violation, it's a precedent." Edwina snatched the mic. "This meeting is not the place for personal disputes." "Then where is?" I shot back. "Because you've sent out thousands in fines without due process, threatened liens without legal standing, and now you're trying to cover it up by calling it aesthetic preservation." She turned to the man seated beside her, Greg, the HOA treasurer. "We'll discuss this offline." Greg looked uncomfortable. "Actually, I didn't approve any updated standards. I thought we were waiting on member input." Edwina's face paled. In the back, someone stood. It was Natalie, a retired paralegal who'd lived in Timber Hollow since it was first built. "I'd like to make a motion," she called out, "that the board be required to hold a community vote before any further enforcement actions take place." Applause broke out. The board members exchanged glances. Edwina gripped her clipboard like it might fly away. "This is out of order," she said, but her voice trembled now. "No," I replied. "What's out of order is threatening fines with no authority. You've overstepped, Edwina, and I'm not the only one who's had enough." Natalie raised her hand. All in favor, dozens of hands went up. Greg hesitated, then raised his too. After the meeting, a crowd formed near the exit. Residents compared notes, photographed each other's violation letters, and started a list of everyone who'd been fined without proper notice. Hank came over with a stack of forms. "We're filing a petition to freeze all enforcement actions until this gets sorted legally," he said. "You in?" "Absolutely," I said, signing my name. The next morning, I got a call from Marissa. She'd reviewed the fine notice and the HOA's bylaws. "It's not just a civil issue," she said. "If they've recorded liens or threatened financial penalties without legal authority, that's fraud. We can take this to the county." An hour later, I was sitting in the county records office pulling property files. What I found made my stomach drop. Edwina had already filed pre-lien notices on 4 homes, all without board votes, all using forged meeting minutes. I took copies straight to the sheriff's office. By the following week, an official investigation was underway. A detective interviewed me, then Hank, then Natalie. The county clerk confirmed the signatures on the lien documents didn't match the actual board members' handwriting. Someone had forged them, multiple times. A warrant was issued. Edwina was arrested for filing fraudulent liens and falsifying HOA records. The local news ran it under the headline, "HOA President Faces Charges in Mountain Community Fraud Scandal." I watched the segment with coffee in hand, and my feet propped up on the hearth of my very legal, very permanent chimney. And Timber Hollow. We held a special election 2 weeks later. New board, new transparency, and a brand new amendment to the bylaws. No fines, no enforcement actions, no architectural changes without documented public approval. Edwina's Lexus was gone by the end of the month. So were the navy jackets and the chimney still standing, just like the rest of us. The first court summons arrived on a Wednesday morning, slid halfway under my cabin door by a deputy who didn't say much beyond a quiet morning. I'd been expecting it, since the sheriff's office brought me in to give a formal statement. What I wasn't expecting was how many names were listed below Edwina's on the case file. 6, total. 3 were board members who'd quietly stepped down after the community vote. 1 was the HOA's former legal consultant, a guy no one had ever seen at a meeting, but who'd been billing the association for services no one could verify. The last 2 were listed as not currently affiliated with the HOA, but had signed off on lien paperwork. One of them I recognized from the property records as the notary attached to several forged documents. The other was a name I'd never heard before. It didn't take long for the news to break again. This time the local station ran a full 10-minute segment. They dug deeper than I had. Turns out, the HOA's so-called compliance reviews had been a lot more sinister than just issuing fake violations. They'd been flipping properties. The pattern was buried in the paperwork. Fine escalation, threats of lien, then quick settlements pushed on elderly or absentee homeowners. Once the owners agreed to let the board sell the property to cover their debts, the homes were handed off quietly and at a fraction of market value to a real estate LLC, tied to the same consulting firm Edwina had hired. Within months, those homes were back on the market with triple the asking price. It wasn't just fraud. It was racketeering. I drove straight to Natalie's house. She'd been indexing the HOA's public filings since the board turnover, and her living room looked like a small town archive. Boxes of receipts, printed emails, and meeting minutes stacked wall to wall. "They put a lien on Harold's place," she said as soon as I walked in, not even looking up from the ledger she was scanning. "You know the red frame out by the creek? Didn't he move to Florida last year?" I asked. "He thought he did," she said, pulling a manila folder and flipping it open. But Edwina filed a non-responsive complaint against the property right after he left, claimed he'd abandoned it and owed over $14,000 in fines. I sat down across from her. "That's not even legal. Tell that to the county," she said, handing me a stamped deed transfer. "Sold last month for $80,000, then listed 2 weeks ago for $265,000. I stared at the buyer's name, same LLC, again. "You think the feds are going to get involved?" She looked at me over the top of her glasses. They already are. That night, a black SUV rolled into Timber Hollow. No markings, no sirens, just a quiet knock on Greg's door. He answered in sweatpants and a baseball cap, then disappeared into the vehicle without so much as a wave. Word spread within the hour. The next morning, Marissa called. "They're charging Edwina under the RICO Act," she said, letting the words hang. I rubbed my jaw, trying to process it. "How far back do the charges go?" 7 years. "They're looking into every property transfer the HOA touched in that time. If what Natalie found holds up, this goes way beyond Timber Hollow." By the weekend, the community center had been converted into a makeshift records depot. Volunteers from nearly every home pitched in. Natalie ran intake. Hank started contacting past homeowners who'd left under pressure. I set up a digital archive and started matching names from the fake violation letters with the list of flipped homes. That's when I found something strange. One property had never been sold, Lot 39. It had the same pattern fines, lien threats, even a forged settlement agreement, but the title had never changed hands. It was still in the name of a woman named Leila Callahan. I didn't recognize it. I looked up the address. It was a small cottage nestled near the Ridge Trail, tucked behind dense evergreens. I'd never seen a light on there, never seen a car. Curious, I hiked up that afternoon, past the switchback until the roof came into view. The place was boarded up, windows sealed with plywood. A legal notice stapled to the door, half ripped and faded from weather. I circled around back, expecting more of the same. Instead, I saw something that stopped me cold, a wheelchair ramp. Half rotted, overgrown, and a worn mailbox with a sticker still clinging to the side. Disabled vet. "Please knock." I called the number Marissa had given me for the county's property fraud unit and gave them everything. 2 days later, they issued a search warrant for the HOA's off-site storage unit. The one Edwina had kept under her name, not the association's. Inside, they found boxes of unopened mail, dozens of returned letters from homeowners who disputed their fines. Some of them had sent notarized statements. Others had included photos, even receipts, all ignored. At the bottom of one box was a folder marked Callahan. Inside, a handwritten note, "Push for default, no heirs, file next quarter." They had tried to steal a disabled veteran's home, and they almost succeeded. That was the final nail. Federal prosecutors filed charges against Edwina and the 5 others for fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. The RICO charges stuck. At the next HOA meeting, now held outdoors under the community pavilion, the new board announced a full restitution plan. Every homeowner who'd been fined under the fraudulent enforcement campaign would be reimbursed. The properties that had been flipped would be reviewed and, where possible, reversed. And a criminal investigation team would remain on site until the last document was accounted for. As for the cabin with the chimney, nobody mentioned it again, but something changed after that. Neighbors who used to keep to themselves now waved from their porches. Kids started playing in the cul-de-sacs again. Someone even painted a mural on the side of the community center. A winding path through evergreens with a stone chimney rising in the background. One afternoon, as I was repairing the edge of my deck, Natalie dropped off a thick envelope. Inside was a certificate of appreciation from the County Fraud Task Force. "You didn't just save your house," she said. "You saved the whole mountain." I didn't say anything, just nodded and went back to work, because for the first time in a long time, Timber Hollow felt like home again. 2 weeks after the mural was finished on the community center wall, I was called in to testify before a grand jury. The federal courthouse sat in downtown Asheville, quiet on the outside but buzzing with quiet tension once you stepped into its marble corridors. I wore the only suit. I owned, a navy one with a creased collar, and carried a folder with the original plans and approval documents for my chimney, though I doubted they'd need them now. The case had grown into something far bigger than my property. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Layla Morrill, met me in the hallway outside the hearing room. She didn't offer small talk, just a quick nod and a gesture to follow. Inside, the room was colder than I expected. A long wooden table, 12 anonymous jurors, and a stenographer already typing. When I was sworn in, I noticed two familiar faces sitting at the far end, FBI agents I'd seen briefly during the search of the storage unit. Neither of them looked at me. Their eyes were locked on the jury. Layla stood behind me when she started. Mr. Grayson, can you describe the first time you received a violation from the Timber Hollow Homeowners Association regarding your chimney? I answered clearly. It was hand-delivered by Edwina Trask in early spring. She claimed it violated updated design standards. And had you made any changes to the structure in recent years? None. It was built in accordance with the original plans submitted and approved 5 years earlier. Do you have documentation of that approval? Yes. I handed it over. She gave the jurors a moment to flip through the pages. Then she continued. Were you aware at the time that the HOA had been issuing similar violations to other homeowners? Not until the board meeting. After that, several neighbors came forward with letters and threats of fines. Layla motioned to the agents. One of them rolled over a cart with 3 thick binders. She opened the top one. These are the letters recovered from the off-site storage unit rented by Miss Trask. Do you recognize this one? She held up a scanned copy. My name was typed in bold at the top. The signature at the bottom was Greg's, but I knew it had been forged. I nodded. That letter was never sent to you, correct? No. The version I received was hand-signed by Edwina alone. Layla turned to the jury. Mr. Grayson's case is significant, not because of the chimney itself, but because it was the first attempt in this scheme that failed publicly. Had Mr. Grayson not preserved the original documentation, it is likely his property would have been targeted for forced sale within the year. I sat back as she transitioned into questioning about the Callahan property. I hadn't been involved beyond reporting what I found, but the jurors needed to understand how that discovery had cracked open the entire operation. They listened silently, flipping pages, occasionally whispering to one another as Layla walked them through the fabricated settlements and the forged notary stamps. When I was dismissed, I didn't wait around. I stepped back into the spring air and walked 3 blocks to a small cafe, hands in my pockets, mind racing. I didn't know what the jury would decide, but it was out of our hands now. What mattered was how the neighborhood moved forward. Back in Timber Hollow, the board had begun holding public forums in the park once a month. No more locked doors, no more surprise notices. I attended the next one, mostly to listen, but also to see how the new leadership was handling things. This time, the crowd wasn't angry, it was organized. Linda from Maple Ridge had brought a proposal to launch a community repair fund for homeowners affected by the fraud. Hank had gathered volunteers to help with physical repairs, fences, porches, landscaping that had been cited as violations under the former regime. Even the newer residents, folks who had no idea any of this had happened, stepped up to help. I spotted Natalie near the refreshment table and walked over. You look like someone who's finally sleeping again, she said, handing me a cup of lemonade. Closer than I've been in years, I replied. Heard anything from the Callahan family? They reached out to the Attorney General's office last week. Leela's niece is flying in next month to take over the property. Apparently, Leela had meant to leave it to her, but hadn't updated the paperwork. She's furious, but relieved it wasn't lost. Glad to hear it. Natalie tapped the table. There's also talk of turning the old HOA office into a community library. Figure it's poetic justice. All that space once used to hide things now used to share them. The following weekend, I got a call from Layla. The grand jury handed down indictments, she said briskly. All 6 defendants, multiple counts each. We're preparing for preliminary hearings now. What's the likely outcome? Edwina's lawyer is already pushing for a plea. If she cooperates, she'll avoid the worst, but the others. She exhaled. They're in deep. Especially the notary and the consultant. They've been laundering the property transfers through shell companies across state lines. That's federal territory. Sentencing, too early to say. But restitution is on the table. The court's ordering asset forfeiture, meaning the flipped properties, could be reclaimed. Or at the very least, the profits returned to the original owners. I hung up and sat on my porch for a long time, watching the ridge trail sway in the wind. There was a stillness to the trees that hadn't been there before. Not silence, just a kind of peace. Over the next month, demolition crews arrived to clear out the last of the illegally built compliance fences. New signage went up along the trails, showing the community's revised charter and a map of the protected zones. A group of teenagers painted colorful arrows to mark the new bike paths. The community, once afraid of its own rules, had taken ownership in a way it never had before. At the final court hearing, I sat in the back row of the gallery beside Hank and Natalie. Edwina stood before the judge in a gray suit, her hair pulled back, voice shaking. She pled guilty to conspiracy and wire fraud. The judge accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation in identifying additional parties involved in the property flipping scheme. Her sentence, 5 years with eligibility for parole in 3. The court also ordered her to pay back over $300,000 in restitution, every cent she'd gained through fraudulent fines and forced sales. The others weren't so lucky. The notary received 7 years. The consultant got 10. 2 former board members were sentenced to 4 years each, and the last fled the state but was picked up in Missouri a week later. Outside the courthouse, a reporter tried to interview me, but I declined. I'd said everything I needed to in the documents, the testimonies, and the meetings. This wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure no one could do it again. Back in Timber Hollow, the community threw a celebration the following Saturday. Tables lined the main road, potluck style. Someone grilled elk burgers. A local bluegrass band played under the pavilion. Kids darted between balloon arches, and someone finally fixed the old swing set near the creek. Toward the end of the evening, Natalie raised a toast with a mason jar of sweet tea in hand. To everyone who stood up, stayed loud, and didn't back down, she said. The crowd cheered. I sat back on the bench near the edge of the field, watching the last rays of sun catch on the mural wall. The stone chimney in the painting stood tall in the center. Someone had added a line under it in careful script, built to last. It was the only time I saw anyone clap just for a chimney.